You're listening to Breaking Biz Dev with John Tyerman and Mark Wainwright. Conversations that break down, beat up, and redefine business development for the professional services firms of tomorrow. And now for your hosts, John and Mark.
Hi, gang. Welcome to another episode of Breaking Biz Dev. I'm John, he's Mark, and we are here to break down understanding. We're going to talk about the importance of understanding. We're going to touch on some key parts of what understanding means from an individual to another individual, and then we're going to apply that to how professional services firms can create a statement of understanding that they can use in their sales conversations and proposals.
I love this topic. I've written about it. We've got a couple links that we can make available to the audience. Understanding is such an interesting topic in and of itself, both kind of personally and professionally, and we're going to kind of touch on both.
Before we dive into our topic today, I just wanted to give a shout out to Bryce, who is a friend of yours, Mark, and Bryce says, for the busy seller doer, Mark and John are like the good angels whispering the words of selling wisdom into your ear that you either never learned or have forgotten. Essential listening for anyone who wants to hone their sales craft and take the next steps in their career. Bryce, thank you so much for the kind words.
Yeah, that was great of him. I very nice. Thank you. Bryce is a longtime friend and a professional connection, and I had the pleasure of working with Bryce for some time. So it is hopefully a testament not just of our professional work together, but of his sort of belief in what we're trying to do out here.
Let's break down understanding, Mark. You've got a quote that you want to read that you really like. Let's start there.
This may throw some people off, and John, I'm not a deeply religious person, but this is a quote from a Dutch priest, professor, and author, and his name is Henry Nouwen. And of course, any proper podcast on sales and professional services firms would begin with a quote from a Dutch priest, professor,
right,
and author. Right. So here it is. The beauty of listening is that those who are listened to start feeling accepted, start taking their words more seriously, and discovering their own true selves. Listening is a form of spiritual hospitality by which you invite strangers to become friends. What do you think?
I think that's pretty powerful. Listening as an invitation. It's a cool way to think about it.
Yeah. It's great. So listening and understanding are intertwined in our lives and in this conversation. And I think what we really want to do, we'll get a little kind of meta on this whole thing initially, right? Then we'll head into some practical applications of understanding. But I want to linger a little bit on the whole idea behind understanding and the importance of it, and let's wander there.
Yeah, let's wander there. I like that. So what is understanding? Let's define that for our audience. What do we mean by understanding?
There's two parts to all of this, right? Because understanding is something that's happening in communication, and understanding it's not just we are hearing or listening, asking questions, getting responses. We are hearing, we're receiving information, that sort of thing. The other important part of this that's a little bit less considered and less intuitive is the other party in the conversation, right? And understanding has this really wonderful exchange of trust and vulnerability and sharing and kind of welcoming. And what I love about that quote is that it paints this picture in our minds of this. Right, he uses the term hospitality. Right, this place where both people are kind of existing in a conversation or some sort of communication, where they are actively and opening, sharing, questioning, discussing, listening, etc. So it's kind of this great little kind of middle ground, which it's not that hard to understand why the whole concept of understanding can be so powerful and is so important in this world of sales.
Yeah, it seems a lot of people want to listen to reply rather than to listen to understand. They've already have the next thing that they want to say locked and loaded and ready to go, instead of really listening to what the other person has to say, or trying to understand where they're coming from and their experiences and how that's shaping what they're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And on a practical sense, right? It's important to touch on this. And John and I, you and I talked about this a little bit earlier. If we're using kind of a sales or a sailing analogy, right? If you and your prospective client have kind of set your sailboat on a particular uh, tack, right, and you're even just a couple degrees off of where they're headed, your compass setting is just a couple degrees off, you're going to end up in different places, come sometime in the future. So this understanding thing, alignments, connection, all of those things. This is kind of a central and core part of that.
Using a sailing analogy for a sales topic, that's that's great.
We have baffled everyone out there.
Yeah.
Like, what are we doing? Are we talking about sailing?
Yeah, it's a nautical exercise.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
why are subject matter experts in professional services firms? These people have master's degrees and PhDs in some cases, and they're very, very intellectual and very smart individuals. Why are they so challenged with listening to understand?
Right. And if you think about it just for a moment, you can very easily start to understand, start to see how a person who has been practicing a particular craft, it doesn't matter what it is, a consultant, an economist, an architect, a person that has been practicing something for so long where they have developed a very deep expertise in this particular area, they start to kind of get the blinders on, right? They're super focused on their craft, so they start to be less and less open to different points of view, different perspective, different ideas, new ideas, etc. So their ability to come into a conversation without assumption and without sort of, oh, I've got the answer for this already. I can save us all a whole bunch of time, and I'm just going to apply my decades of expertise and knowledge. They're going to come in the room having made so many assumptions that it limits and almost destroys their ability to be sort of truly curious and kind of to create that space needed to really listen and understand, right? So that's what happens, and John, I see it again and again and again.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm sure that they've gone through, they have decades of experience, and they recognize different patterns. But I think, to your point earlier about listening as an invitation to kind of see someone for who they are and be vulnerable with another person and connect with a person on a human level, and it doesn't matter what your expertise is or what your solution is, the other person needs to feel comfortable with your solution. So how can experts overcome those blinders, right? So how can they break those blinders off and be more open to listening to understand?
I think this happens hopefully naturally as people progress even further into their expertise or their craft. I think at some point, and I'm hesitant to assign some kind of age or timeline to this whole thing, but I think at some point individuals start to recognize that I know so much, but at the exact same moment I know so little, right? So it's so we kind of cross this threshold. But the challenge is that for a lot of people, that happens really, really late in their career, right? It happens super late. So these are people who are seeing the value of being a good mentor, and seeing the value of having good conversations. But these are happening to very senior people in a lot of these professional services firms. So it might happen. It happens in many, but it happens quite late. And our hope here is that through this conversation and kind of through sort of elevating the importance of understanding, is that people start to recognize how this is super critical throughout their entire career, And John, we're just not talking about business here. We're talking about the importance of this in people's personal lives, of coming into relationships, conversations, meeting new people, and being open and curious and ready to kind of, create that space that both people can sort of, have this really nice sort of exchange of information and ideas, and just creating that sort of that hospitality, right?
Yeah, yeah. You make a good point about how these are skills, soft skills that you can apply to any human relationship. I'm a father of three young kids, and um, I regularly use these tactical empathy tools like mirroring and
Mm.
labeling emotions to help my children kind of understand and kind of connect the dots, and understanding their experience and their point of view. It really helps kind of connect and kind of put the guard down a little bit so we can have a real conversation.
Right. I am in sync with you on that. My children are, I guess, what I would call grown now, but my wife is a preschool teacher, and she spends many of her waking hours with 3-year-olds. So we are endlessly involved in this, and sometimes, John, I feel like she's treating me like a 3-year-old, but maybe it's
She's
good
trying
for
to
me.
understand you. That's all.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that.
Um, well, there's value in understanding and interpersonal relationships, but let's talk about how we can apply understanding to in a sales conversation. Mark, in one of the blog posts that you shared with me that I read before this podcast conversation was about the statement of understanding. So, what exactly is a statement of understanding, and why is it so critical to client conversations?
I'm not certain that I coined that term. I may have come across it. I don't really know, but I recall at some point, over the last number of years, coming to realize the elevated importance of this subject. So I started digging in a little bit to sort of just the idea of understanding, and um, there's not a lot out there relative to the business world. When you start wandering into places like psychology and other areas like that, it's more prevalent, but it was fairly new in this sort of context, right? So why I called it the statement of understanding was simply because I couldn't find anything out there I had never created, I had never experienced, I had never seen something that was really what I was trying to what I was after was a way to create and then put forward a statement of understanding that is completely about the client. And there's a number of other characteristics with it. We'll get into the details of what this statement is, but I'd never seen it, right? I'd never seen it as an important part of this whole world of sales and selling. I had never come across it. So I said, all right, I'm gonna create this thing. I'm gonna call it the statement of understanding, and it's going to have a very specific sort of framework. It's going to have some specific content with the goal in mind of creating this moment, this place inside of in our context, John, inside of a proposal or inside of a sales conversation, creating this place that says, you know, this is everything we have come to know and understand about you and your situation, your needs, et cetera, creating this safe space of exchange where the recipient of these statements of understanding, whether they're hopefully presented or whether they're in a proposal, they say, "Oh, right, they get us."
Having it be able to stand alone kind of signals that, hey, I've taken the time to listen to you, and here's what I heard back to you. I guess you call that, but we call that looping, right?
Well, it's looping, it's parroting, it's mirroring. There's got a bunch of different terms. I know in the psychology world, it's called looping. Um, but yeah, the process, effectively, this is a tool that allows the expert, the practitioner, to take in the information and then reflect it back in a particular framework. And typically the the very end of this statement, hopefully this is happening in a conversation. Typically, the very end, you say, "Okay, did I get that all right?" Which is great.
You're calibrating your compass, to use your sailing analogy.
Right.
So,
Exactly.
all right, so let's break it down. Let's break down what a statement of understanding is. So, Mark, what are the key parts that make up a statement of understanding, and how do they kind of all fit together?
There are 4. There can be others. These are the 4 elements of the statement of understanding that I think creates a real comprehensive tool, a real comprehensive statement that you can use, like I said, either spoken or in a document of some kind. The first is the big picture. The second is the moment of change, the inflection point. What happened? What spurred someone to think, act, do something? I.e., come to you. What is the vision that they have in their head of some future state of success? Right, having gone through some change, something new. What does the future hold? And the last one I think most skip over, and we'll dig into more details on all of these. What are the implications of success or failure? I.e., what if you do nothing and the status quo continues to exist, versus what if you do something? Like, what is the greatest thing that could possibly happen? And a lot of times you can start to bring in not just the intangible, what are people seeing, thinking, feeling, et cetera, behaving, but the tangible stuff. Like, you can really start to assign dollars and cents to this. It's like, oh, if we don't change, we're gonna this whole business unit is going to fail. Conversely, if we do make changes, if we start thinking and doing things a different way, millions of dollars, whatever the dollar amount is. So that's where we start to actually bring some teeth to this whole thing. So those are the 4 that I generally have in my framework.
Okay. So the big picture, that's really kind of what's the organizational setting, what's the business environment that they're operating in, and what's the challenge that the business is trying to solve. The inflection point, I like to think of that as a trigger moment. It's really kind of what sets someone off on a buying journey. And so it's within that context of the big picture, this trigger moment, this inflection point happens. And then I think this is where buyers tend to kind of lose clarity on what they need, and that's where the kind of the salesperson can come in and bring in this vision of the future and show them the opportunity cost of doing nothing, versus, and then showing them the art of the possibilities. What does good look like? What are the implications of success or failure if you don't go with some sort of a solution? So those are all great elements to a statement of understanding. So let's shift gears a little bit and let's talk about, now that we know what this is, okay, how do we put this into practice? How do we implement a statement of understanding? How can professionals use this in their sales conversations and their proposals?
It is important to start to incorporate this early on in your selling process, particularly when you've reached the point where you're starting to propose new ideas, right? So the statement of understanding is the if part of the if then statement. And I know, just follow with me on this a little bit, right? So there's a logic here, right? That's the logic. There's an if then logic, right? So the statement of understanding is the if thing that says, if all of this is true, if all of these things are the case or the situation, then these are some potential solutions to that, right? These are some potential remedies, some potential opportunity, some options that we can talk about, some approaches to working together that will help you kind of resolve, what's happening in your organization. It is critical. It is that if then logic part. And most of the times we just skip right over the if part. In our proposals, John, they're like, all right, we've got a cover letter. The first sentence says something about we're excited to do something, and the entire rest of the document from that point on starts talking about how great you are. It's completely focused on you. So, right. So this is the opportunity that says, look, here's the situation, big picture. Here's what changed in your organization. Here's what you see as a potential, solution to all this potential outcome, and here's really what it's worth. That gives us the opportunity to say, okay, so this is the foundation that we're going to build our potential approaches from. Did we get that right? Right? Did we get that? Did we understand everything clearly? Did we get that right? So that's the first big part of this. It comes early on in that document, sets the foundation of whatever your approach is. And like I said, this is either going to be in a document, hopefully it's in a conversation, but it sets the stage.
Yeah, I want to dig into a little bit of the conversations leading up to this for a second. So I've seen a lot of sales motions, that first conversation, which is typically, it should be some sort of discovery call where you're really listening to understand what the challenge is, and you're gathering information, and you're actively listening to kind of what the pain points are. I suppose, you shouldn't have any sort of presentation or pitch deck on that first call, right? Because that kind of takes away from the whole point of listening to understand and trying to gather information, right?
Right. Yeah. Ditch the pitch deck, John. Don't even bring it.
Don't even share anything.
Because you're going to, don't. That's because you're going to find that, if you've got 60 precious minutes of time to work with this prospective client, and you bring your pitch deck, you've just destroyed 45. Yep. Right. And their eyes start to roll back in their heads, and they're like, oh boy, this is not what I had in mind. And frankly, these guys don't even understand, they haven't understood us, right? They haven't listened. They haven't understood us at all. So yeah, no pitch deck. And this, for me, just to kind of paint the picture of the sequence of events, this starts at the very first conversation. Mm-hmm. Frankly, at the very first email, if it's a lead that comes in, that says, hey, I think we have this particular need, and let's have a conversation. Great. Let's have a get to know you sort of introductory conversation. And then a subsequent conversation, from my perspective, would be a deeper dive, like discovery conversation. So it starts very, very early on from that, when, if I get a lead and I sit down and, chat with someone about, seeing if this is a good fit, kind of really exploring what prompted this whole thing, I will take my notes and I will parrot them back. Right after that, great to talk to you within a couple days or so after we've met. I basically share my notes and say, look, this is everything we talked about, and this is what I understand to be your situation, et cetera. We haven't gotten anywhere near solutions or any of that stuff yet, pricing, none of that. But we've talked a little bit. At least I've started my understanding, my journey, to kind of understand their situation, and I reflect that back to them. Next conversation, maybe it's a deeper conversation, maybe it's a discovery conversation where I have a good bit more prepared, questions about, digging in more deeply to, who are we talking about? Who's involved? Tell me more about this. Tell me more about the individuals that this is impacting, and, from my perspective, this has to do with sales stuff. How's your sales engine? How's your sales function working, et cetera? Again, get the information, from a really good, curious conversation, and I reflect it back to them. And this, this hopefully happens just a couple times. That, hopefully, John, we're not finding ourselves in situations where we're having 20 discovery calls. Yeah, bad idea. Yeah, bad. But after you've had just a couple or a few conversations, you've now created a good bit of your statement of understanding, right? So when the proposal time comes, you're going to be able to go back and look at your emails and take that information and now assemble it in that 4-part framework that I talked about. And then towards the very bottom of it, you can, flesh out the latest information that says, look, and, the implications, right? This is the last little bit that says, look, if you don't do this, here's some wonderful things. If you don't do this, here's the bad things that are going to happen. And if you do achieve that vision that you want, here's the great things that are going to happen. So you've got a lot of this thing built already. The only step now, hopefully in your proposal conversation, is you just spend, a couple minutes at the very beginning of this conversation. It says, look, before we move us a step further, here's what I heard. Here's what I've come to understand. Did I get that right?
Yeah, the reason why I wanted to go back and kind of talk about some of those earlier conversations in the sales flow is because it all builds up to that if then statement, right? So
Mm-hmm.
if you're taking the time
Yep.
to parrot back or mirror what you heard in those early sales conversations and stay aligned along the way, then that if then statement is going to be more close to the truth than not, and you won't be so far away when that time comes. So
Yeah.
so Mark, do you have any real world examples? Let's say that is there um, a scenario where you have a well crafted statement of understanding that really stood out to a prospect, or maybe it helped you stand out in a sales conversation?
From my perspective, John, this is not an option. I believe that this is a compulsory part of a good quality sales process. This is an absolute this, and I use this every single time that I have a new prospective client that I'm working through my sales process with. I use this every single time. And even from the early conversations, when I've met with someone once, taken my notes, reflected them back to them, and my last line is, did I get that right? I have received the response that said, this is great. Thank you so much. These notes are great. It seems like we're really aligned here, which is like music to my ears. The prospective client very early on is saying like, wow, I think even from that first conversation, Mark, it really seems like you asked good questions. You really listened well. And now you've understood, where we are now, where we want to go, et cetera. So it is powerful. And, I firmly believe that, a good quality statement of understanding is a powerful differentiator for firms, almost to the level of sort of how they practice their craft, right? Most folks will say, no, 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 no. If we're an architecture firm, it's like our design work is our most important differentiator. And I'll say, maybe, maybe, right? Maybe you've got a lot of really good, talented, competitors out there. And frankly, you just had 2 partners and 5 associates, just leave 6 months ago to start their own firm. So guess what? Their expertise is on par with yours. But if a firm really adopts and embraces this whole process of, creating and then sharing, understanding consistently throughout this early sales process, it is a powerful differentiator.
Well, it seems that what it can do is it sets up the client engagement for success, right?
It
And
does.
so,
It does.
if your client engagement is successful, then you've developed a good relationship with a buyer, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. John, I'm certain you've got an example or two that come to mind.
For me, I risk kind of spending a little too much time asking too many questions. Um, I do really try to understand. I guess that comes kind of back from my background as a researcher.
Oh yeah,
I when I was doing interviews with buyers of professional services and sellers of professional services, um, the follow up questions that I would use are really kind of meant to dig layers deeper. So like
yeah.
there's a research technique called laddering. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's essentially just a
Mm.
fancy way of saying why in multiple
Yeah,
times in a row to try to really uncover what the interviewee is trying to tell you. Or
oh yeah, right.
so I think that's just maybe one technique that you could use in sales conversations is maybe think like a researcher instead of a salesperson, right? Try
Mm.
to really kind of
Good.
tease out what they're trying to say. I guess that's really probably the most applicable.
I think I think it's fantastic and actually really, really useful because I think a lot of people will find themselves in that situation. And I think it's a great ad. A lot of people will say, oh, I just listened to John and Mark's podcast. Hopefully a lot did, right? And they think, oh yeah, I just need to come into these conversations and be curious. Great. I can be curious and I'm going to ask endless questions, right? And then I'm maybe going to have another conversation where I'm just going to just ask a ton of questions, right? So this is part of the reason why I'm presenting sort of that four-part framework, in that it is good to be curious, it is good to ask lots of questions, it is good to kind of pursue this deep understanding, but do it within a framework so you're not wandering off kind of into into the dark corners. Stay focused, because this framework that I've presented the big picture, the moment of change, the inflection point, right? This picture that they have of success in the future, and really what it means, implications of success or failure, can be a pretty tight sort of framework that you can fit your questions into, that doesn't waste anybody's time, but really gives you, and frankly, gives the prospective client a really nice story, a really nice picture around sort of this need that they have. So great. I think that's an excellent comment.
Yeah, so I guess that's maybe one misconception that folks might have, is that you can go in and just ask endless questions and kind of try to understand their perspective. But that's kind of vague. I like how you put that. Organize your questions around each of those four components or parts of the statement of understanding. So maybe being too chaotic with your questions might be one misconception. What are there other misconceptions that you've seen out there that maybe professionals who are trying to do this, maybe they don't do it so well?
The number one that is always top of mind for me is they don't make it an explicit part of either a conversation or a proposal document, right? It's not a standalone piece. They say, oh no, we have that woven into our approach, our statement of work, our ideas, that sort of thing. And it's hard to tease it out of that. It's hard for, when the reviewer is, when the recipient of this is actually kind of reviewing this document or trying to navigate a conversation, they're switching back and forth between, themselves, what their needs are, and the potential applied, solution, whatever. So they're doing this switching because they can relate to everything that is their situation, but then they're not able to connect the dot between what their need is and what the potential solution is, right? So they're doing this switching going on. So my recommendation is to have it be a standalone piece. Now, if you refer back to it when you are putting together a recommended approach or approaches or a scope of work, if you reference that statement of understanding, great. But I think it needs to start off, it needs to be separate. It needs to be 100% about the client. I cannot underscore that enough. It needs to be something that, from top to bottom is completely about them, their situation, needs, etc., so that by the time they reach the end of that statement of understanding, they say, oh, they get us, right? That's your goal. And sort of, not to get too meta again on this, but there is an unlocking that happens as soon as we understand that, as soon as we believe that someone gets us, right? That they understand, there is this, oh, right. Okay, now we're ready to take the next step together, and trust increases, confidence increases, clarity, focus. All these great things happen once we finally unlocked that little thing, right? We're all walking through this door together that says, okay, they get us and we get them, and we are of like mind.
Mark, I think our listeners are going to get a lot of value out of this, and I hope that folks are implementing the statement of understanding into their next proposal.
I hope so as well, John. This has been a good conversation. Until next time.
Thanks for listening to Breaking Biz Dev. Subscribe on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, or listen to the show at breakingbizdev.com. This episode was produced by Red Cedar Marketing. If you think a business podcast is right for your company, visit redcedarmarketing.com to learn more.